I will be kicking us off then, so welcome. And within the next hour, you will be in company with our guest of honor, which is Heather Hoff, be together with Marina Andersen and myself. My name is Louise Davidsen. Heather joins us all the way from California, and she's the co-founder of the organization Mothers for Nuclear, which we'll get to know much more about within the next hour. I was super excited when the guys from the Danish division of the organization Nuclear Power Yes Please contacted Marina and I to see if we would be willing to host this discussion with a female nuclear expert. Because Marina and I, we represent a liberal party called Moderaterne, and we ran for election for the parliament in Denmark last year in October and November. And running for election did, of course, mean that we would be out campaigning, meeting people on the streets, joining debates, writing articles, being active on social media, you name it, we did all of it. And one of the hot topics during the election, and of course still, is climate changes. And whenever we would meet people or we would post comments on social media about climate changes, the conversation would very quickly turn into a discussion about sustainable energy and pros and cons about nuclear power. But what we noticed was that it would be men joining the conversation, posting comments on social media, and very often there would be a lack of women joining in on the debate. So when we were asked if we would join this one, we said yes immediately, because this is our chance to raise some of the questions women might find interesting when it comes to nuclear power. And it's interesting to be talking to female experts about this. As Heather started off mentioning, this is going to turn into a podcast, and we hope there will be more female experts lined up after this one. So it means Marina and I will pass on the baton to someone else to be hosting after this session, but we'll see how it goes. And as we started off saying, your questions are more than welcome in the chat. We'll try to take as many of them as we go along. But I'm going to pass it on to Marina, and then we're going to talk much more about Heather after that.
Yeah, I can copy that. To introduce myself a little bit, I ran for parliament, as Louise said. I work as a lawyer. I'm 46 years old. Haven't been involved in politics, don't know anything about nuclear power plants, nuclear energy, but I'm very much interested because I see it as something that is really missing in the Danish debate, not only for female voters, but in total. It's like it's been lacking for years. Also just in a European context, I think Denmark is behind in the discussion. So Heather, I think we're ready to start out with you and have you introduce yourself and who you are and what your background is for working in this field.
Yeah, thank you so much. I'm really excited to be here. I'm Heather Hoff. I co-founded an organization called Mothers for Nuclear, and I'm really excited to be talking with you both. I'm sure you get lots of great questions about nuclear and maybe don't know how to answer them. And I still get questions like that I don't know how to answer. And I'm definitely don't have all the answers. I think it's a really complex technology, and there's a lot of history and a lot of current developments. It's hard to keep track of it all. And I'm really excited to share with you why I started Mothers for Nuclear, why I care about nuclear, and kind of some things that I hope to accomplish. And yeah, so I live in San Luis Obispo, California, and I went to college here. I have a degree in materials engineering, and I kind of grew up in the wilderness in Arizona in the desert without many resources and didn't really know much about energy, but my dad was kind of, concerned about overpopulation and concerned about the impact that people have on our planet and how to protect our planet. And I grew up using very little composting. We had a composting toilet. It was a huge embarrassment to me, I was going through middle school to have people over to the house, and like hanging our laundry outside, and just trying to use as little as possible and reuse as much as possible. So when I went away to college, I began to get frustrated that I couldn't convince other people to be like me and use less. People didn't really have the priority on recycling and using less energy, turning lights out, even simple things, and I quickly got pretty frustrated and kind of, lost my environmental way for a while. But eventually, after I graduated from college here in San Luis Obispo, I couldn't find an engineering job for a while. So I worked some random jobs around town. I actually manufactured animal thermometers for a while. That was interesting. And then I worked in a winery, and I also worked in a clothing store where I made about $7.50 an hour, like $7. It's not very much. And, I have an engineering degree. And eventually I just said, this is ridiculous. I need to get a real job. I'm going to try Diablo Canyon. So for those of you who don't know, Diablo Canyon is a nuclear power plant. It's close by to where I live here in California, and I'd always kind of known about it. I was curious about it, being an engineer and kind of scientifically minded, but I was also pretty nervous and pretty scared of it. When I decided to try and get a job there, my family made a lot of comments that made me really nervous about it. My uncle's a physics professor, and he was concerned about radiation. My mom told me, I don't think you should be working there in your reproductive years. And I was like, what? Why? That's super scary. And I didn't really know what to think. But I'm a very curious person, so I decided to go in and just ask a lot of questions and try and figure out the situation. If there's something nefarious going on, I was going to tell the public about it, And so, I went in and I asked a lot of questions for a lot of years.
So can I just stop you just a minute? It sounds to me like you were brought up with a big awareness on environmental issues, maybe with a different perspective, but still with that in mind, that awareness of recycling and making
definitely
the planet last.
I wanted to find a way to help save the planet. Like I had Save the Whales posters, and lots of my parents were donors to every single nature and environmental organization that I can think of. And I grew up.
Do you feel that what you're doing now with nuclear, does that correspond to your upbringing?
Well, it took me a while to realize that, after that 6 years of asking questions, I started to realize that a lot of things that I thought about nuclear were misperception or misinformation, or maybe they just sounded scary, but weren't actually dangerous. And then I realized at Diablo Canyon specifically, there's a picture of the power plant right here. I'm not sure how well you can see that, but it's a beautiful site. And we make 10% of California's electricity on this tiny footprint of land that's surrounded by nature and wildlife, and it's just pristine and beautiful. And I began to feel really proud, like this is what I can do to help the planet. I can help make this clean electricity, emission-free electricity on this tiny footprint with very little impact to our planet, and it supports humanity. Humanity needs energy. That's something that I'd realized, when I was kind of asking other people to conserve, that life's really hard. The way that I grew up is hard, not using energy, like we didn't have air conditioning, and I lived in Arizona in the desert in the summer, and it was not pleasant. And a lot of things that I did growing up were just not pleasant, and people don't want that. They want better quality of life. And for that, they need more energy. So I began to realize that nuclear is in alignment with my environmental and humanitarian values.
What kind of technology do you work with now at the power plant? So what's your focus there at the moment?
So I started out as an operator, a plant operator. Like I mentioned, my search for a job, I would basically have taken anything. So I applied to be an engineer and I applied to be an operator. I didn't really know what that was at the time, but they're the ones that called me first. So yeah, I was like, okay, I'm going to go do this. And I learned all about how the plant works. I did, equipment monitoring and walk downs of the plant areas. And basically it was kind of like the eyes and ears for the control room. We monitored trends and looked for any problems, identified, like any equipment that needed to be worked on so maintenance could come in and fix it. And I did that for a few years. Then I went back to even more training. There was a lot of training just to do that job. And then I went back to get even more training to get my license to operate the reactor. So that was pretty hard, pretty challenging. This right up here is actually my license with the Nuclear Regulatory Commission that says, I was granted the authority to operate the reactors at Diablo Canyon, units 1 and 2. It's pretty cool. I'm very proud of it. It took about 2 years of training and, classroom training and practicing on the simulator and being in the plant, learning from other operators who were qualified. And I basically learned all about how to operate the power plant. And then I worked as a reactor operator for a while in the control room. And I'll have a lot more to say about that in the future, but it was a really great job. It was also rotating shift work, which is hard to do when you have young children. So my daughter is now 13 and I have a day shift job now writing procedures for operators. So that's the guidance that we use, to tell operators how to run the plant.
And if you, with your own words, had to describe what nuclear energy, what it is, how would you describe it? So it's easy for everyone to understand what it is, because it's quite complex, right?
Yeah, it's funny. I don't often, go back to that, but yeah, it's basically, it's a way to make electricity. It's a way to boil water, to make steam, to drive a steam turbine. So it's technically a thermal power plant, but the difference is that we don't burn a fuel like coal or natural gas or oil. So we don't have the emissions that go with that kind of burning. Sometimes we do say we burn the uranium, but it's a little bit different. It's a process called fission, where atomically, a neutron hits a large unstable atom of uranium. And because that atom's so large, when the neutron hits it, it can split in half, called fission. And that process releases a lot of heat energy. So that's the heat energy that we use to boil the water, instead of burning a fuel. So it's a pretty cool process, and it's special because uranium is a really dense fuel supply, like a little bit of fission goes a long way. So we don't need very much uranium. We can use a kind of a small amount of fuel to make a huge amount of power. So that's one thing that's pretty cool about it.
So you said that 10% of the use of electricity in California comes from Diablo? Was that?
Yes, yeah. So Diablo Canyon, I think last year, it depends how much electricity we make and use, but last year it was about 8.6% of the total of California's electricity. And I don't know if you heard the recent news, our governor's all excited about it, but California is now the 4th largest economy in the world. So it's a pretty huge amount of power that we make, in one power plant.
Okay, is that mainly supplying the big cities, or how does that work? Is it close to one of the big cities, or?
We're not very close. Someone was just asking me whether we associate more with Los Angeles or San Francisco. Los Angeles is to the south and San Francisco is to the north. We're about midway between, in an area of California called the Central Coast. And Santa Barbara is kind of close to us, and Santa Maria, not super big cities. So basically we put our electricity onto the grid in California, and then, the grid control operators are the ones that decide how to distribute the power and where it goes. And that's something that's a little hard for people to understand too, is like anytime you plug into the grid and you're using power off the grid, your mix of generation, like what you're getting your electricity from, is whatever is on the grid at that time. So we have some great software in California from our independent system operator. They're the ones that control the grid, and they can tell us real time how much electricity is coming from nuclear, solar, hydro, natural gas, and stuff like that. So it's pretty cool to be able to say, you know, like when I plug in my electric car, oh, I'm charging it mostly from natural gas right now in the evening. That's not cool. I don't like that. I'd prefer to charge it from nuclear, but yes, it's good. It's a good thing to be aware of what's on your power grid at the time is what you're using.
So is it expected to get higher, the nuclear part of energy use in California, or is it just stable as it is?
Yeah, well, that's part of the reason I started Mothers for Nuclear is, you know, after I spent all this time changing my mind about nuclear and realizing how amazing it was, then my company announced that they were going to shut down the nuclear power plant. And I was like, what? This is crazy. This is the worst decision. And what can I do about it? And I realized that, like you were talking about earlier, there aren't very many female voices in nuclear. It's a bit of a hard place for someone, you know, to go work in and explore. And that I had a little bit of a unique perspective. So I decided with my friend Kristen Zaitz to start Mothers for Nuclear and try and share what we had learned and try and, you know, reverse that decision. And I don't know if you've heard the news recently, just recently last year, they reversed that decision and they decided that we need to keep operating Diablo Canyon for at least 5 more years. So that's great. And a really good progress, and I hope to make that even longer. But so right now, nuclear in California, my power plant Diablo Canyon is the last nuclear plant operating, and we have some laws that make it hard to do new nuclear. We have a moratorium in place, but there's some groups that are working to overturn that, and so I hope that we'll build more nuclear soon. No plans on the horizon yet, but yeah, right now our power supply is pretty stable and we rely a lot on natural gas. And, you know, part of the reason that our state decided that they could shut down Diablo Canyon is they were hoping to transition to renewables. So that was 6 years ago, and they just didn't make very much progress. It was really hard. We've been putting a lot of money and effort into it, and we're still using more than 50% natural gas for our electricity. So,
Heather, there's a question in the chat. So when did you discover that the fear about nuclear power is not fear, but misinformation? And I'm going to add to that, is that what you see in general when you're out with your organization, Mothers for Nuclear, that you can see it's typically misinformation?
Yeah, well, there's definitely a lot of misinformation out there. One of the things that was really scary for me was about Fukushima. And even now, if you do a Google image search on Fukushima explosions, you'll see these spherical tanks, you know, burning orange, crazy chaos, and it's scary, but those are natural gas. That's an oil refinery that comes up when you do a search on Fukushima. So that's misinformation. And there's examples like that all over the place that really scare people for the wrong reasons. However, I think a lot of stuff that's true about nuclear is also just really scary. And it's all right to have that fear response. That's something that we do at Mothers for Nuclear, as we talk more openly about that. It's all right to have an emotional response, you know, as a human, and especially like as a female. I'm still scared of radiation, even though I know better. Like sometimes I have to talk myself down and be like, okay, like I know this isn't dangerous, but you know, I still recognize that as a human, something that you can't see that could maybe hurt you and you don't know how much and you don't understand the units, it's just naturally kind of scary.
Are you familiar with nuclear plants in Europe in comparison to your plant? Do you know if we do things differently, or is it like one and the same?
In terms of the total amount of energy?
In terms of the type of plant, is it like the same type all over the place?
there's a lot of different kinds of nuclear power, and I'm still learning about them. And there's a lot of advanced technologies that are coming out, and it's really hard to kind of get your mind around all the different types of nuclear power. In our plant, we have a pressurized water reactor. It uses light water, normal water, as a coolant. In Canada, they use heavy water as their coolant, and they use naturally occurring uranium. For our plants, we have to enrich the uranium slightly. And so there's lots of differences and lots of different designs around the world. And I just love all of them. The more I learn about them, I'm just, yeah, there's so many great options.
And how many nuclear power plants do we have around the world? Do you know that?
Oh gosh, I don't know. Wasn't Morton just saying that earlier? I think they make 20% of our global electricity, maybe. But yeah, it's a huge portion of our clean electricity, for sure, our emission-free electricity, because around the world we still use a lot of coal and oil and gas. So yeah, Morton.
So where
440, he's saying in the chat.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Okay. So what is that the number for?
440 in the world.
Is that the number of plants?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. So where are they primarily based? Is that America?
Well, the US is a large country. So we have the highest amount of nuclear power plants. There's also a lot in China and Russia. And I mean, it depends on the country, but like France gets 80% of its electricity from nuclear. They did a huge build out of their nuclear fleet to try and reduce their dependence on foreign oil. And that was a huge success for them. So yeah, there's a lot of nuclear. And let's see, I think Morton's saying that there was about 10% of the world's electricity comes from nuclear. So I was a little off on that, but yeah, so let's see. Louise is asking in the chat, a scary myth about nuclear civilian power is that it's directly associated with producing plutonium and nuclear weapons. Does that have some truth in it? A little bit. I mean, I think some people try and deny the connections between nuclear power and nuclear weapons, just, you know, out of nervousness or to make nuclear power look better. But I mean, realistically, they're somewhat connected. If you look at the countries that have nuclear power or nuclear weapons and where the overlap is, it's not, you know, a direct comparison. And you mentioned civilian nuclear power. For example, my plant, there is a little bit of plutonium produced in the reactor, in the fuel as it operates, but the way we store our used fuel, there's really no way to get that, and definitely no way to like make it into bombs. It just kind of, it goes up there and it sits on the hill, and there would be a whole lot of technology and you know, security involved in order, you know, to actually do anything with that. So it's pretty impossible to actually connect a civilian nuclear plant with, you know, like creating a bomb type material. So that connection's not really there.
So one of the things we discussed during the election, when we started talking about nuclear power plants and so on, people would ask, where do we want to put it? So, you know, do you typically put nuclear power plants like inland, close to the sea? You know, do you take things like earthquakes, tsunamis, stuff like that into consideration when you build a power plant? Can you put it anywhere in the world, basically, is what I'm asking.
I think pretty much you can, and there's enough different designs with different constraints that we can do that. For cooling, Diablo Canyon, my power plant uses ocean water, and it takes a fair amount of ocean water to cool the power plant for normal operations. We're lucky we're here on the Pacific Ocean where it's really cool, and so we have a big, we call it our ultimate heat sink, and it makes our plant very efficient to have like that cold of a body of water next to us. Some plants use rivers or lakes for their cooling, so they have a little bit less of that delta T, you know, to drive the thermal process, difference in temperature, you know, between the plant and the cooling supply. One plant that I know of, Palo Verde, is in Arizona in the desert, and there's no water there, but they use reclaimed water from the city of Phoenix as their cooling. So I think that's pretty cool that, you know, the idea that you could build a plant in Fresno, California, or somewhere where there's, you know, not really a large body of water, but you could use the wastewater from a city to cool a reactor. So for cooling, you know, like there's lots of options. And in terms of, you know, natural disasters, I think plants can be built in ways that are just so protective, and they're way over-engineered. And, you know, I hope someday that maybe they won't be quite as over-engineered, because we spend a lot of money doing a lot of things to kind of help people feel better in ways that don't necessarily add to the safety of the plant or to risk reduction. So I think it's a fine balance, but yeah, generally we could build nuclear anywhere.
I was just going to ask, how long does it typically take to build them? Because we often hear stories about, you know, it's going to take at least 10, 20 years to build them. And then we also hear stories from China where they can build them in 4 to 6 years. So, you know, is the quality still the same? Does it really take 20 years to build, or can it be done in less time?
Yeah, so so many issues in that one question. Let's see how we're doing on time. We're about halfway done, just for all of our awareness. And yeah, thanks everyone for keeping to throw questions in the chat. We'll try and get to those, or if we don't, we'll leave some time at the end. In terms of nuclear build times, that's a question that I get a lot, and it's you know, a lot of people's biggest objection to trying to, you know, spend money on nuclear in order to address climate change, because it feels so urgent. So that being said, I think, you know, nuclear is, we've typically built large plants, large scale, and they do take a long time to build, depending, you know, where and what country, and if they have, you know, what kind of regulation they have in place. But, you know, if we spend 10 years building one nuclear plant, and also spend 10 years building a whole bunch of solar and wind the whole time, you know, what we get at the end of that 10 years, nuclear is extremely powerful. It's a very large source of energy, and it's available around the clock. So it ends up being pretty valuable. And, you know, I think not even comparable. It's like levels above in terms of, was this investment in time worth it? And a lot of nuclear advocates like to say, yeah, of course, the best time to build nuclear was 10 years ago, but the second best time is right now. Like, we got to start, we got to do this right now.
I was thinking about the uranium, because we built this, you said building a plant, it takes 10 years. We have the technology to build a plant. The plant needs to be supplied with uranium coming in and being used, as I understand it. I also understand that uranium comes from the ground. Does it come from the ground anywhere? Can we find it here in Denmark, or where do we find it?
Yeah, so uranium is very plentiful in the crust of our Earth, and something that's been discovered kind of recently is that in seawater, there's a natural concentration of uranium, and there's some groups now that are trying to develop techniques for how to get the uranium out of seawater. And they've discovered that as they would do this, extract the uranium from the seawater, that there's like a natural balance where more just leaches out of the crust into the seawater. So it kind of stays at the same concentration. And people like to say, oh, uranium's renewable. There's just like always more of it, which is a great idea, but we don't do seawater extraction yet. Right now, most of our uranium comes from mining. And as I mentioned, I grew up in Arizona. I actually grew up in a little mining town. It was named Globe after the discovery of a big globe of silver. It's now a copper mining town, but so I've grown up with the impacts of mining kind of front and center. My scenery growing up was just tailings piles everywhere. And when the wind blowed, it's just like, that's what we breathe, is the mining tailings. And so I'm very aware of impacts of mining. And there are some concerns with uranium mining. How I like to view it as is that, like I said earlier, uranium's a really dense source of fuel. So you have to mine less of it to get, you know, like pretty good bang for your buck. So I like that. And yeah, mining's hard no matter what we're trying to extract from the earth, including materials for, renewable power sources. Those are pretty impactful as well.
As I started saying in the intro, Heather, that when we did the campaigning for the election, we had the conversations on social media, debates, and so on, and with people on the street, it would typically be men joining the conversation, not so many women. What do you think that is? Why don't we see more women being part of the debate when we're talking about nuclear power?
Well, I think we're starting to get there, but like I mentioned about my job when I first started, it was maybe not, definitely not super friendly to females. There was a lot of fear and misinformation about what would happen to me specifically as a female if I worked at a nuclear power plant. And so part of it's misinformation and fear. And part of it is, the lifestyle of people that work at power plants. It's kind of, a hard, impactful thing. Like I mentioned, I did the rotating 12-hour shifts when I was an operator, and that's not an easy thing for a lot of women, especially if you want to have children. And so I just think there's a lot of challenges. We just hired a new class of operators at Diablo Canyon. Since we're going to continue running for more time, they're like, oh my gosh, we need more people to run the plant. We just hired 20 new operators, and only 2 of them are females. So the trend continues, and I'm not totally sure what to do about it, but I hope that, by more of us talking about it and helping people feel comfortable with those scary things and get answers to that misinformation, that we can encourage more females to work in nuclear and support nuclear.
One of the things we also often discuss with people is it's often a discussion around renewable energy versus nuclear power energy. And it's kind of like, can they not go hand in hand? Do they need to eliminate each other? Is it not possible to have both?
It's such an interesting concept and something that I struggle with a lot. Our mission at Mothers for Nuclear is actually about clean energy. It's building a global community of support for clean energy. That's ultimately what I care about. It's not, like we have to do all nuclear all the time. However, the more I learn about renewables, the more I see, a lot of shortcomings that we're not really talking about. And I hope we will more. And the more I realize that we keep kind of spinning ourselves up, trying to go renewable and not having appropriate focus on nuclear, which is a hugely powerful solution. And so some people, ask nuclear advocates sometimes, like, why do you attack renewables? And we're not really meaning to, but at the same time, there's a lot of people that support renewables, not very many who support nuclear. And those people that support renewables, they kind of have like a blind faith in them. And so in some ways, I feel like that needs to be, torn down to the truth. And so that's my take on it. And yeah, it's a hard thing because I really do support all clean energy, and I want us to have the best mix of whatever works. I just want us to do what works. So
where do you see the limitations with renewables? What are the big issue for you with renewables?
Well, the biggest one, and one that I see in California specifically, because we've been trying so hard to do renewables, and in Germany, they're very similar, is the intermittency. They're just not available for sure when you need them. And so that necessitates backup power supplies, which are usually fossil fuel. It kind of locks us into having that available all the time, no matter what, because you don't know when the wind's going to die. You don't know when there's going to be a severe weather event, like flooding that takes out, whatever. I just say that because we're having flooding right now, but we had fires, and the smoke blocked a lot of our solar for a long time. And so it's just really hard to predict. Therefore, you always have to have that same amount of backup power. And so, yeah, I just found that's the biggest limitation, is that they're not there when we need them, in combination with we don't have enough storage. We don't have a good way to store electricity. Like batteries are a drop in the bucket. Most of our energy storage comes from pumped hydro. And that's a process where, we use the potential energy of water in two reservoirs, like two lakes. And we can store the water up high. When we need electricity, we let it flow down the hill and it generates electricity in a turbine, goes to this other reservoir. And then if we have extra electricity, we can pump the water back up the hill and then, kind of store energy that way. So about 95% of our electricity storage is in pumped hydro right now. And so that's like a huge leap for a lot of people too, because we hear so much talk about batteries, and our batteries just aren't there yet. We don't have enough raw materials. They are still pretty inefficient, like about 80%. So we lose energy by charging batteries. And so the lack of storage is probably the biggest reason that renewables are going to be a huge challenge.
Okay.
Let's turn to the chat, because there's a comment in here from Henne where she's saying she grew up with a lot of fear of nuclear accidents, but now it's kind of the opposite for her. She's getting more and more interested in power, in nuclear power, to save the planet, not only for her but also for her children and grandchildren. And then there's a question from Bettina. She's saying, it sounds like there's no risk at all with nuclear power plants, and all the fear is based on misinformation. I think that sounds a little too good to be true. Are you saying that because some pictures were wrong, there's not been any disasters with nuclear power plants?
Yeah, so Hannah, thanks for that perspective. That's how I feel as well. And there was actually, I had a really small birthing class when I had my daughter. One of the other moms was from Japan and one was from Belarus. And so both of them, like Fukushima and Chernobyl, both of them have kind of like this fear of nuclear accidents. And it's been really interesting talking with them over the years, like after I started Mothers for Nuclear, and they're pretty skeptical. And there was a pretty big turnaround recently when I got back together with them a couple of years ago, and they both said, we've been watching what you're doing, and like, we don't necessarily like it, but we're kind of changing our minds about nuclear, and we see why you're doing what you're doing, and it makes sense. And that was pretty huge for me to hear that. And so to Bettina, no, I'm not saying that there's no risk and that everything's perfectly fine. So that's the first thing. And I don't want to paint too rosy of a picture. I do want to make sure we accurately compare the risks to all the other options. If we don't do nuclear, what are we going to do instead? And is it better? And what I've found is that there's just a lot of misinformation about what that risk actually is. And like I mentioned earlier, a lot of things sound scary, and maybe we overreact in ways that make impacts that might not be there otherwise. But the things that sound scary aren't necessarily dangerous, and that's been a really, really challenging thing for me to realize. So you mentioned about disasters with nuclear power plants, and Fukushima is probably the most recent example that a lot of you may have heard about. It happened in Japan, and three reactors melted down, which is a huge deal for our industry. It created a whole lot of fear. I was in the control room at Diablo Canyon running the power plant, and they pulled up in the news in our briefing room, and we kind of like would rotate back there and watch, and we saw their plants exploding over in Japan, just across the ocean from us. And that's my worst nightmare as an operator. I'm scared to death. I'm thinking, they don't know what's going on with their plant. They don't know if people are hurt. They don't know if their family's okay. They've just had this huge earthquake and huge tsunami, and they can't communicate with anyone. And it was just like terrifying. And then on top of it, there was a whole lot of media attention, for that event, and a whole lot of misinformation about the spent fuel pools burning, and a lot of things that turned out not to be true. So that made it worse. All of that fear caused us to do an evacuation. The evacuation actually killed 2,600 people. So no one was hurt by events that happened at the plant itself. And when I realized that, as an operator and having been so scared about it, I was like, oh, well, we kind of did this to ourselves. Our fear of nuclear is what is dangerous, not nuclear itself. And it took me, months to get to that conclusion, but that's my ultimate conclusion. I have a story on my website about Fukushima if you want to read that. I'll try and put the link in the chat a little bit later. And it's about my visit. I went over there, and I don't want to minimize it, for sure. It was hugely impactful to the people there, and they're continued to be stigmatized and labeled as contaminated, and they can't sell their produce and they can't go fishing because people are scared of radiation. And so that's what I think are the actual impacts from that event, and we're creating them. So that's partly, again, why I do Mothers for Nuclear, is to talk about that. And we need to stop doing that, like we need to stop overreacting to things
but
that
you said
we
the
don't
fear
understand.
of radiation. Is that the same as there's no radiation in their fish and what they produce at Fukushima?
Like when we were talking about uranium, it's all around us. It's naturally occurring in our planet's crust. So there is radiation around us. And another thing I like to do at Mothers for Nuclear, and I brought my props here. I have this little pendant. I don't know if you can see, there's like an atom symbol on it. This is made of uranium glass. My dad was a glass blower, and one of his students made these for us. And you see it glows green under UV light. So that's because of the uranium in the glass and its response to the UV light. And I wear this around my neck. It's a nuclear necklace. And I do that to demonstrate how radiation is all around us, and it's not necessarily dangerous. We understand it pretty well. Most of the time we do still have, some overreactions when, trying to make decisions about big events like Fukushima that happened. And I think a lot of what we did with that was an overreaction to the radiation. It's there, but it's not dangerous. Does that make sense? Does anyone have thoughts about that?
Definitely does make sense. If we have someone here in the audience, Heather, that would like to start like a Danish division of Mothers for Nuclear, what would you recommend they do?
Oh my gosh, that would be so exciting. And yeah, that's something that's been great to see over the last few years. When we started Mothers for Nuclear, we felt pretty lonely, like we're the only ones out here doing this. And the movement to support nuclear has really grown. And we actually now have chapters of Mothers for Nuclear in Germany, the UK, Canada, and Australia, and would love to have more. And we are full-time working moms. So if you want to start a chapter, we will help you as much as possible and give you information and materials and moral support. This is quite challenging, and I probably couldn't have done it without my friend Kristen being here by my side. But yeah, because it's not always popular to talk about nuclear and supporting it, and these things that are scary. It's hard to communicate about when, like we get requests from the media to talk about nuclear. I'm always pretty nervous because anything I say could be misinterpreted or, like intentionally skewed. You never really can tell, but yeah, we'd love to help support anyone who's interested in Mothers for Nuclear and our messaging. And we'd also love to direct you to a host of other pro-nuclear organizations that also support more nuclear. We have, stickers. This one says Save Diablo. It's my power plant. It was made by a group called Stand Up for Nuclear, and Generation Atomic is great. And there's all kinds of amazing nonprofits.
So there's a whole community out there ready to help if needed. Yeah. Good. Let's take some more questions from the chat. So
okay, Hannah asked about waste material.
Exactly. So how do you contain it?
And something that let's see, 10 minutes. There's so much we could talk about. In terms of our used fuel, it's like we have a lot of, have you guys seen The Simpsons? It's a cartoon, and Homer Simpson works at a nuclear power plant. He basically has my job. He's a reactor operator, and I get teased a lot for that. Like, oh, you have Homer Simpson's job. But in that cartoon, there's a lot of stuff about like nuclear waste leaking from barrels and like glowing green ooze. And, you know, I kind of wonder if it's green because of, you know, this issue. It's the same color of green. But our used fuel is not actually glowing green. It's a solid pellet inside a fuel assembly, which is loaded into a cask, a metal cask that's welded closed and then put in a concrete cask. And it's very isolated from humans and the environment and stored on the hill behind our plant, you know, on site. In the United States, we don't have any reprocessing of our used fuel. So it all just kind of sits there after we're done using it, which a lot of people object to, but I think it's actually pretty fine. It's just very small for the amount of power that it made. You know, like I mentioned, we make 10% of California's power. We've been doing that for 40 years. And we have this, you know, kind of small concrete pad with some canisters on it. And that's all of our waste. So I think it's pretty all right. You can hug a dry cask. I see Michael making a comment there. As an operator, I do rounds on the dry cask storage system. We go up and we walk around, and it's a passive system, which, you know, the used fuel is still generating a little bit of heat even after we take it out of the reactor. So it's a convection system with air vents at the bottom of the casks where air can kind of come in next to the metal cask, but, you know, inside the concrete, and it cools the fuel and the hot air goes out the top. So as operators, we would go and check and make sure none of the vents are clogged by debris, you know, like bird feathers and stuff. So that's our used fuel. It just kind of sits there. So that's a short answer.
So I've heard that you can deposit it in the ground also, but you don't do that
Finland
at Diablo,
is the first
but
country.
it's being done, or what?
Yeah, you can build a deep waste repository to store it underground, you know, even more isolated from people and planet. Yeah, so that's possible. And I know, you know, Canada is working on some deep geologic options to store their used fuel. And now with advanced reactors getting a lot more attention and development, there's more talk of how to keep that used fuel kind of available to us as a future energy source. I don't know if, I guess it was before the meeting officially started, but I mentioned my friend Emma. She works for a company called Oklo. They're making small micro reactors, and they're actually looking at taking used fuel from power plants like mine and making it into their new fuel. So they want to make more clean electricity from it. And I think that's great. So I'm excited about that.
Pretty cool. Yeah, it is. There's another question in the chat, because earlier you were talking about you cool down the plants with water. So there's a question: what about if climate changes led to severe droughts and power plants wouldn't have enough water to cool them? Could you cool them down in any other way?
Yeah. Well, yeah, it's complicated, and climate change is going to be a huge issue for a lot of our technologies. And I think our best strategy is to have a lot of options going forward. In California right now, you know, we already rely on a lot of hydropower for electricity. And when we have droughts, that, you know, contribution from hydro goes way down. And so that's an impact that's already happening. In terms of having cooling available to a plant, I don't see climate change and severe weather really impacting that. But I mean, essentially, that's kind of what happened at Fukushima when they lost power for so many days in a row. You know, like all of their passive cooling systems began to kind of run out. It took multiple days after, you know, the earthquake and the tsunami before things started to go badly. But like I said, when I talked about Fukushima, even, you know, like that's a pretty worst case scenario. It's pretty uncommon, and a lot of stuff had to go wrong. And even if you talk about all of that, you still have to look at the impacts, like what actually was the impact, and can we manage that better? And is that, you know, like riskier than all of our other options? So
yeah, so you're also saying we shouldn't expect to see that anytime soon. It was kind of a rare case. It was worst scenario we could see there with Fukushima.
Well, I think anything can happen, and like something different is going to happen next time, and that we have to manage our expectations and not overreact out of fear. Like there's risks with everything, you know. A lot of people don't know about solar installations and the amount of fires that they're starting. We have the Topaz solar farm in California. It was one of the largest in the world when it was built. And it's already started 3 grassland fires, you know, over the last 6 years, and, you know, pretty damaging ones. It's in the Carrizo Plain, which is this natural, beautiful area. I think it's a national monument. And Amazon, the company, has, you know, stopped installing rooftop solar on their warehouses because they've had so many issues with toxic fires and explosions. And so I just I don't want to like paint a rosy picture of nuclear. I just want us to look at all the options, you know, under a fair lens and pick the best mix. I think that's our best bet.
I was thinking, what are your academic goals now? It seems like this is also a very big career for you. So what do you think might be your next step at Diablo or somewhere else? Or
I definitely know I want to keep supporting nuclear. That's the only thing I really know for sure. And in terms of questions, I'm going to put my email in the chat. I want anyone to feel free to contact me if they have follow-up questions. I'd be happy to have a conversation with you, to meet with you, answer questions via email or whatever works for you. And in terms of my future, Diablo Canyon is going to keep running for an additional 5 years. I'm pretty excited about that. My job writing procedures for operators feels pretty impactful. You know, I help people run the plant well, efficiently, and I help also operators. One of the big things that we do is spend time practicing on the simulator. And that's, you know, something that I really enjoyed when I was an operator. And now that I'm writing procedures for operators, I still get to go down to the simulator and, you know, test out the procedures and make sure they work well for people. They're understandable and easy to follow. And so I still like my job, and I definitely want to keep supporting continued operation of Diablo Canyon. At Mothers for Nuclear, we kind of have 3 pillars of what we support in terms of nuclear. And the first is to keep existing plants running, keep running existing nuclear, because if we shut them down, they're pretty much immediately replaced with fossil fuels. So if we're talking about clean energy, we don't want to dig a bigger hole. Just keep running our existing plants. They're great plants, they're robust, they're built to last. And that makes the most sense financially and for lots of reasons. Number 2, build more nuclear. We have great existing technology. It's fine. I think we should just build more plants as much as we can, as fast as we can. And number 3, advance nuclear, support innovation and new technology and all those other fun, cool ideas that can reuse used fuel and you know, operate without cooling water, be deployed to remote locations, you know, in Alaska, replace diesel generators. There's so many great options. So all 3 of those things is what we support at Mothers for Nuclear. Louise made a comment, cool fact, the total impact on a citizen around Fukushima from the radioactive materials release as gas into the environment, if he or she stuck around for the entire event and lives his life out in the same area, is, according to the UN body UNCEAR, equivalent to the background radiation received by a Dane in 1 year, including medical x-rays. So there's some units thrown in there. I don't know sieverts who use REM at my plant. That's one of the things that's kind of bad about radiation, is it's a little hard to, you know, kind of go back and forth and understand what levels people are talking about. I think that's one of the things that makes it a little scarier. So that, it's a really great point. The stuff, you know, like the worst case scenario at Fukushima, the radiation that is out there is a pretty small amount. What else? Looks like Morton shared a picture of a dry cask. I can show you some more props. We were talking about uranium and radiation being all around us. My dad was a glassblower, like I said, and he had this little figurine. It's uranium glass, so that's pretty bright. Wow. It glows under the UV light in my little ducky. And I recently discovered that a lot of my dishes are radioactive. So This is called Vaseline glass. It's made with uranium glass. Last time I visited my mom's home in Arizona, where I grew up, in Globe, Arizona, I realized that a lot of her dishes are green and might be radioactive. So I had my sister get out a little black light and we went and we checked all the cabinets, and nearly everything in the house is radioactive. And it was quite funny because my mom's partner, who helps take care of her, she has dementia, but he's been living there for quite a few years. And he's like, oh my gosh, how did all this radiation get in here? Like, has it always been like this? And he got kind of scared. I don't know if it should be, it's very personal. I'm sorry to share this, John, but yeah, it's worrisome to a lot of people, that it's all around us, and it can be kind of scary, but it could also maybe be reassuring too. So that's why I try and hope to talk about it. I think
we have a good question here. Oh, I really like the question. Any advice for a person wanting to pursue a career in nuclear?
Well, like I said, at the beginning, I was looking for a job and I couldn't find one. And I was like, okay, I'll try Diablo Canyon, and didn't really know what I was getting into, but quickly learned that there are a lot of options. We hire a huge range of people, and like even just as an operator, you don't necessarily have to have a degree. We have a milkman and, like lots of other random people, like someone who worked at our local state hospital, for mentally ill people, change careers and come into nuclear and become an operator. And so, yeah, all kinds of people from all kinds of backgrounds can go into nuclear, and we hire all kinds of engineers at the plant, civil, and we hire chemists and design people, drafting people. We do a lot of construction, building scaffolding, and hiring extra people to come in anytime we have a normal refueling outage. We do a lot more work on the plant that's just kind of like fix up everything while the plant's shut down, and then we can operate longer again. And yeah, so there's all kinds of options in nuclear. Yeah, I'd be happy to chat more about specifics over email if you feel like emailing me.
There's also a good question from Søren. How should nuclear advocates communicate facts about nuclear power to audiences without a technical background, without it being simplified to the point where it's being condescending?
Yeah. Well, I would say maybe it's kind of funny, but like, just don't communicate the facts. Communicate the feelings, and maybe back them up with facts. And that's something we try to do differently at Mothers for Nuclear. And something that I think the nuclear industry has struggled with, for a long time. They've tried to teach people, educate the public. Here's how the plant works, and here's how radiation won't kill you or will kill you depending how much, and here's how like this thing works, and it lots of people just don't really connect with that. And so I'd like to see us talk more about the value that nuclear provides and the feelings that we have, why we care about it, and then kind of back it up with facts. I don't know if you guys know much about our politics here in the United States, but we've had a struggle recently with what they call it, like fake news, and people that just don't acknowledge the facts. And I've been thinking about that a lot with Mothers for Nuclear, and how it doesn't necessarily matter what the truth is. It's about connecting with people, and from there, after you build a relationship, then you can kind of go forward to other things.
There's actually a question in the chat to Marina and myself. So how has your attitude to nuclear power changed over time until now? Marina, do you want to answer that one?
Well, I've never really had an attitude towards nuclear, because it's not been in Denmark. It's just been like locked out from the debate and from the ground. So we haven't had it in our face to discuss it. And then it's come up in the previous years. And my view on it, or my take on it, was that we need to get rid of fossil fuels, and what are our options. And like you said earlier, I didn't see windmills and solar panels as one and only because they depend on the weather and they take up so much space. So something must be done in a more clever way. And I don't have that fear of Chernobyl. I remember it. I remember Chernobyl as one of the first things I remember from my childhood. But I think that memory is so many years ago. So my take on it is that we need to be curious. We need to focus on it also in educating people in Denmark, not just educating the public to understand it, but also educating people to handle nuclear, and being able to take it in as an energy source in Denmark as well. So I was hoping that in the new government program, it would have been said that we would take it more in, but it's not in the program. We put it in Moderaternes program to begin with, but the new government is 3 parties now, and they haven't really settled on taking in nuclear. So do you have any comments on that, Louise? Why it didn't?
No, I think it's more, I think it's just important we have this type of discussion. And I totally agree with Heather. It's often about the facts, but you kind of forget to talk about people's feelings and emotions, which is where the fear stems from. So if we can address that and not, as women, be so afraid to join in on the conversation, because the feelings is just as important as the facts. That needs to be part of it as well. So I'm glad we're having this conversation. I hope we'll have many more with other experts as well to start that conversation and just see where does it take us in Denmark. Because you're absolutely right, Marina. It hasn't been something we needed to face before. It was something that happened in other countries, and that was fine. They could do whatever they did, but you know, we need to be proactive and we need to consider what do we do. So that's definitely something I take with me on this.
Thanks. Yeah, Sebastian asked about how to address the gender aspect, and we did talk a little bit about why nuclear might be challenging for women to get into or be interested in or work in. Regarding how we address it, at Mothers for Nuclear, we do it with storytelling, and we do it by being vulnerable and putting ourselves out there as an example. Like, here's all the stuff that, you know, like I used to think, or I used to be scared of, and it might sound like some of the stuff that I used to think is pretty ridiculous to me now, but I think it's really important to share those stories about what I learned and how I learned it, and hopefully other, you know, females can see that and, you know, absorb it and maybe have some learnings in a way that, you know, doesn't take 6 years of relentlessly asking questions in a job at a nuclear power plant before changing your mind. And yes, I hope to be an example for other women in terms of my acceptance and how I got there.
Did you start out at California University, or where did you get your degree? I don't remember. You might have said it.
Yeah, well, I grew up in Arizona. I actually went to college in Arizona for a year at the University of Arizona in Tucson, where I was studying chemical engineering. I ended up transferring to our local university here in San Luis Obispo, Cal Poly, California Polytechnic State University. And that's where I got my degree in materials engineering. And, you know, then wanted to stay in this area after I graduated, and realized pretty quickly that like lots of people didn't even know what materials engineering was, for one thing. And I just graduated at a time where there weren't many jobs in engineering. And yeah, so that kind of set my path for me. And I'm so thankful that I ended up in nuclear, because I had no idea that it would be, you know, my thing. And now it's such a huge part of my life, and it's my passion, and it's become, you know, like my childhood dream of saving the planet. And now I kind of think this is my role, and this is how I do it, is by sharing what I've learned about nuclear and why it's so important. And I envision a future where we have a whole lot of clean energy and people, you know, have good quality of life with less impact on the planet and can make choices about, having children or not, and that we stabilize our population and that everyone just has a life of plenty. And it's pretty huge utopia, but I hope nuclear can help us towards that goal.
There's a question about the differences between the old reactors at Chernobyl and the modern technology.
Yeah. Well, a lot of people don't realize that at Chernobyl, the other units kept running after, the one exploded, all the way up until I think 2003 or 4. So those, they made a few changes to their design. I don't know if you've seen the Chernobyl miniseries. But yeah, those reactors kept running for a while, and there were people on site, running those and making power with them. In terms of the differences with other designs, yeah, that was a very, specific Russian design, and probably not the best idea for numerous reasons. But again, just like what we talked about with Fukushima, I think it's really important to take that event in context with everything else and to recognize what caused the actual impacts. I think we know more about nuclear technology now, and we know not to send, the liquidators in to grab chunks of fuel and like throw them over the pit into the, just don't do that. They're the ones that died from that event. And I think now, I hope now that we would know better and we just wouldn't do that, So a lot of, there weren't very many deaths associated with that event, but the ones that were, I think we could avoid them, even if something similar like that happened. I don't expect it to ever happen, but like I said, I don't want to discount any possibilities with, climate change and extreme weather. I think a lot of stuff is going to change. A lot of things are going to happen, and we have to be ready. And we have to not overreact, and we have to know, what really is the priority. So I hope that I can, help us respond appropriately in the future if something happens.
There's another question about the nuclear waste and final depository. So what's the plan now? And is the US government investigating this, given the fact that, for instance, Finland has built a final depository in their deep rock?
Yeah, I'm excited about Onkalo. That's a great facility. I hope to visit it someday and learn more about it. The United States is in a little bit of a mess right now in terms of how we go forward. We had a proposed facility called Yucca Mountain in Nevada that was going to be our national repository for waste. And there was a lot of political reasons that didn't happen. And now, we're kind of, I don't know all the details, except that there's, certain barriers in place. And, I think the government gets sued by power plants every year. They have to pay because they have this commitment to deal with the waste from power plants, but we're not doing it. And so there's just all this money transferring hands. It's a big mess, honestly. And I don't know the best path to resolve it, but I do know that our current Department of Energy is focused on getting to some better solutions, and they're investigating processes for what's called a consent-based siting of waste facilities. And right now it would be like an interim waste storage. So it would just, we would kind of consolidate all the used fuel from our power plants in a temporary location, and then find a better plan for it. The future better. Like I said, I think it's fine. It's pretty fine where it is, but we could consolidate and have some cost savings there. So yeah, like I said, our government's looking into ways for how to site facilities in ways where the community has a lot of input to the process, and they want the facility because there's economic benefits and because they know the risks, which are pretty small and manageable, and they make the decision that they want the facility in their area. And so I think that's a great idea, and I hope to help with that process.
Cool. I think we'll finish with the last question in the chat, which is actually a good question, because among our friends and family, we all have people in favor of nuclear, but we also have the ones who are against nuclear. So how do you have a good conversation with them about this without it ending up in a conflict? Any suggestions?
Gosh, yeah, I don't know, maybe have your friend talk to them instead. I'm partly teasing because like I don't have a good answer. I still have family members that are pretty resistive to what I do and why, and I don't really understand it, and I'm not sure how to reach them. So it's yeah, I'd love to hear anyone else's input if you have any personal experience to share. I have, you know, a very educated family member who told me once, you know, well, I buy power from a plan that's 100% wind power. I buy wind power, and that's my electricity. And I asked him, you know, well, what do you think happens when there's not enough wind for all the people that are buying wind power? Like, how do you get your electricity? And he's like, oh, well, I buy the wind power, so like it's wind power, like that's all there is to it. And he just kind of refused to look a little bit deeper. And you know, companies that do that, they have to buy, you know, carbon credits or some other mechanism to still be able to say that their power is 100% clean, but it's not really. And it's a really interesting scenario, and it's just complicated, and some people don't want to look, you know, no matter kind of what their background or who's telling them. So that's one of my, I guess, challenging examples. But yeah, I would say just continue to share what you know, and be honest, and yeah, admit the downsides. And if, you know, they see you behaving in a way that's, you know, with integrity, then they're more likely to try and consider what you're saying.
Thank you so much, Heather. And thank you so much for the many great questions we had in the chat. Heather, you put your email in the chat. It's heather@mothersfornuclear.org if they want to get in contact with you. So feel free to reach out if you have any more questions for Heather, but it's a wrap for now. So thank you so much for this first session. I hope it's going to turn into many more sessions where we can talk about nuclear power. This one was very interesting. So thank you.
Look forward to it. Thanks, everyone.